Somewhere beneath the dry, cracked earth of modern Pakistan, buried under centuries of dust and forgetting, there once stood a city of 40,000 people. It had running water. It had public baths. It had a drainage system so advanced that nothing in Europe would rival it for another 4,000 years. The streets were paved. The houses were built of kiln-fired bricks manufactured to exact standardized dimensions. Wells provided fresh water to individual homes. Covered channels carried wastewater away from residential quarters through a network of drains so carefully engineered that each junction included removable stone inspection covers, allowing maintenance workers to clear blockages without disrupting the flow. This was urban planning at a level that most cities in the modern world did not achieve until the 19th century. And then, over the course of perhaps a single century, all of it was gone. Not conquered, not burned, not swallowed by the sea, just abandoned, quietly, completely, and without any explanation that has ever been found. That city was Mohenjo-Daro, a name given to it in modern times that translates roughly to Mound of the Dead. And it was not alone. At its height, the civilization that built Mohenjo-Daro stretched across nearly 1.3 million square kilometers of land, an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Scientific estimates suggest it may have supported a population of 5 million people, perhaps more. They built over 1,500 known settlements, ranging from tiny hamlets of a few dozen residents to sprawling urban centers housing tens of thousands. They traded with kingdoms across the Arabian Sea. They developed a system of writing that filled thousands of carved seals and tablets, inscriptions that have been studied by scholars for over a century. And yet today, not a single word of that writing has been deciphered. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the names of their rulers, if they even had rulers. We do not know their gods, their songs, their stories, or the reason they vanished. 5 million people, occupying one of the largest urban civilizations in the ancient world, and we cannot read a single sentence they left behind. This is not a fable. This is not myth wrapped in legend. This is documented archaeological fact, confirmed by decades of excavation, analysis, and scientific dating. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization after one of its major cities, flourished for over 700 years in what are now the nations of Pakistan, India, and parts of Afghanistan. It was a contemporary of ancient Egypt and Sumer. It may have been larger than both. And unlike those civilizations, whose stories have been painstakingly recovered through deciphered scripts and royal inscriptions, the Indus Valley remains almost entirely silent. We have their bricks, we have their beads, we have the careful geometry of their streets, but we do not have their voice. We do not have the stories they told their children before sleep. We do not have the names they whispered to their dead. We have the skeleton of a civilization, stripped clean of every word it ever spoke. Think about that for a moment. A civilization of millions, cities with population densities comparable to some modern towns, sophisticated craft production involving semi-precious stones sourced from hundreds of kilometers away, standardized weights following a precise mathematical system, long-distance maritime trade networks reaching across the Arabian Sea to the ports of Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. All of it thriving during the same centuries that the pyramids of Giza were rising in Egypt. And yet we know the names of Egyptian pharaohs, the prayers they whispered to their gods, the taxes they collected from their farmers, the songs they sang at funeral processions. From the Indus Valley, we know almost nothing of this kind. We have objects without stories, architecture without authors, a silence so deep it has lasted nearly 4,000 years. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why that silence exists, what it conceals, and why the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization is one of the most haunting unsolved puzzles in all of human history. You are going to walk through the ruins of cities that were forgotten for millennia. You are going to examine the strange artifacts that have baffled generations of scholars. You are going to confront a question that has no comfortable answer. How does an entire civilization, one of the largest and most sophisticated the world has ever known, simply cease to exist? And you are going to discover that the answer, or rather the lack of one, has implications that reach far beyond the ancient world and touch the very foundations of how we think about human achievement, human memory, and the permanence of everything we have built. There is a phrase in archaeology for what happened here. They call it cultural discontinuity. It means a break in the chain, a gap in the record, a point where one way of life ends and another begins with no visible connection between them. Cultural discontinuities occur often in the archaeological record, usually on a small scale, a village abandoned here, a tradition lost there. But what happened to the Indus Valley was not small. It was total. An entire way of life, shared by millions of people across a continental scale territory, vanished and was replaced by something simpler, something smaller, something that bore almost no resemblance to what had come before. The discontinuity was so complete that when scholars finally recognized the Indus Valley civilization for what it was, they struggled to connect it to anything that came after. The chain was not merely broken, it was dissolved, like ink dropped into a river, spreading thinner and thinner until no trace of the original pattern remained. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand what was lost when the Indus Valley civilization vanished, we first need to understand what it was. And to understand what it was, we need to step back and consider the broader canvas of human settlement, the slow, uneven process by which scattered groups of people became villages, villages became towns, and towns became the great urban centers that we call civilizations. According to scientific estimates, the earliest permanent human settlements appeared in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. These were small clusters of mud brick houses, rarely home to more than a few hundred people. They grew crops, they kept animals, they made pottery, but they were not cities. They lacked the specialization, the density, the institutional complexity that we associate with urban life. Over thousands of years, some of these settlements grew. Uruk in Mesopotamia, one of the first true cities, may have reached a population of 40,000 by around 3,100 years before the Common Era. Memphis in Egypt, the capital of the Old Kingdom, held a similar number. These were the great metropolitan centers of the ancient world, places where written language, organized religion, centralized government, and monumental architecture all converged for the first time in human history. The Indus Valley civilization was their equal. In some ways, it was their superior, and, in one crucial way, it was entirely different from both. The story of its modern rediscovery begins in the 1820s, when a British Army deserter named James Lewis, travelling under the false name Charles Masson, wandered through the Punjab region of what was then British India. Masson was a complex figure, a soldier who had fled military service and reinvented himself as an antiquarian, a collector of coins and relics. Near the town of Harappa, he encountered an enormous mound of crumbling bricks and rubble. He described it in his journals as the ruins of an ancient castle, a place of considerable extent. Local people told him the bricks were cursed, that the city had been destroyed by divine punishment for the sins of its inhabitants. Masson recorded the site, sketched it, made some notes, and moved on. Nobody paid much attention. The mound was old, it was crumbling, and the British colonial administration had far more pressing concerns than a heap of bricks in the Punjab. Decades passed. In the 1850s, British engineers building the East Indian Railway discovered that the area around Harappa was rich in old, well-fired bricks. The bricks were dense, hard, and uniform, far superior to anything being produced locally. They were perfect for ballast, the crushed material laid beneath railway tracks to provide drainage and stability. And so, in one of the most devastating acts of archaeological destruction in history, thousands upon thousands of ancient bricks, each one carefully manufactured to precise, standardized dimensions by craftspeople who had been dead for 4 millennia, were pulled from the ground and crushed beneath the advancing tracks of colonial infrastructure. Miles of railway were built on the pulverized remains of one of humanity's greatest cities. An entire archaeological layer of Harappa was destroyed to support a train line. It is impossible to know how much was lost. The bricks that were crushed may have contained markings, inscriptions, or structural information that could have helped later archaeologists understand the city's layout, its construction techniques, its phases of development. All of that is gone, ground into dust, and spread across the Indian countryside beneath the wheels of locomotives. The irony is severe. The very quality that had made the Indus Valley bricks remarkable, their durability, their precision, their uniformity, was what marked them for destruction. They were too good not to use. It was not until 1921 that serious archaeological excavation began at Harappa. That year, an Indian archaeologist named Rai Bahadur Daya Ram Sahni started formal digs under the direction of Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Marshall was a classicist by training, deeply knowledgeable about the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, and he approached the Indian subcontinent with the assumption that its ancient past would be measured against the standards of the Mediterranean world. He was not prepared for what Harappa would reveal. Almost simultaneously, another archaeologist named Rakal Das Banerjee began excavating a site roughly 600 kilometers to the south, at a place called Mohenjo-Daro in the Sindh province of what is now Pakistan. Banerjee had initially identified the mound as a Buddhist stupa, a religious monument from a much later period. But as he dug deeper, he realized that beneath the Buddhist layer lay something far older, far larger, and far more significant than anything he had expected. What both men found was staggering. Beneath the soil lay the remains of vast, carefully planned cities, not the chaotic organic sprawl of most ancient settlements, where houses were built wherever there was space and streets followed the paths of foot traffic, but gridded, deliberate, engineered urban landscapes. Streets ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles. Major thoroughfares were wide enough for cart traffic. Smaller lanes branched off at regular intervals, providing access to residential blocks that followed a consistent pattern of layout. Houses were built of uniform bricks with consistent proportions, a ratio of 1:2:4 in thickness, width, and length. This ratio was maintained across every site in the civilization, from the largest city to the smallest village, across an area of over 1 million square kilometers. The standardization is so precise that archaeologists can identify an Indus Valley brick at a glance, without any other context. It is as if an entire civilization agreed on a single building code and followed it without deviation for 7 centuries. Drainage channels ran beneath the streets, covered by removable stone slabs for maintenance. Each house had its own bathing platform and its own drain, which connected to the street drain, which connected to the main drain, which carried wastewater to the edge of the settlement. Wells dotted the residential areas, providing fresh water to individual homes and neighborhoods. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large waterproofed basin measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep, was surrounded by a colonnade of brick pillars and was constructed with a sophistication that suggested not only engineering skill but organized communal ritual. The basin was made watertight by a layer of bitumen, a naturally occurring tar, applied between 2 layers of carefully fitted brick. It was fed by its own well and drained by a covered outlet. The engineering is faultless. It works. After 4,000 years, the basic design still makes hydraulic sense. John Marshall, upon reviewing the combined finds from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, announced to the world in 1924 that a previously unknown civilization had been discovered, one that rivaled and perhaps predated the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The announcement was published in the Illustrated London News, reaching a wide audience. The reaction was immediate and profound. The entire framework of early human history had to be reconsidered. There were not 2 cradles of civilization in the ancient Near East, there were at least 3. And the third, the one no one had known about, was possibly the largest of them all. In the century since Marshall's announcement, over 1,500 Indus Valley sites have been identified by archaeological surveys across a territory stretching from northeastern Afghanistan to the coast of Gujarat in western India, and from the borders of Iran to the upper reaches of the Ganges-Yamuna plain. The civilization's footprint covers an area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the core territory of ancient Egypt, the narrow band of fertile land along the Nile, covered roughly 34,000 square kilometers. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, occupied around 150,000 square kilometers. The Indus Valley civilization, at its greatest extent, was larger than both of them put together many times over. It was, by area, the largest civilization of the ancient world. And it was not just large in territory, it was dense. The major cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Ganwariwala, Rahigahi, and Dolavira, were not small outposts scattered across an empty landscape. They were substantial urban centers, each one home to tens of thousands of people, each one equipped with the full apparatus of organized urban life. Rahigahi, in the Indian state of Haryana, has been the subject of intensive excavation in recent years, and may prove to be the largest Indus Valley site of all, covering an area of over 350 hectares, larger than Mohenjo-Daro. Dolavira, on the island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch in Gujarat, was a walled city with separate citadel, middle town, and lower town areas, each enclosed by its own fortification walls. Its water management system was extraordinary even by Indus Valley standards, with massive reservoirs carved from living rock to capture and store monsoon rainfall in an arid environment where every drop of water was precious. The site of Lothal, also in Gujarat, provides evidence of another dimension of Indus Valley sophistication: maritime trade. Lothal featured what appears to be a dockyard, a large rectangular basin connected to a channel that led to a nearby river and from there to the sea. The basin was lined with baked bricks and equipped with a sluice gate to control water levels. If the identification is correct, and it is debated by some scholars, then Lothal's dock represents one of the earliest known examples of engineered maritime infrastructure in the world. Ships would have entered the basin at high tide, loaded or unloaded their cargo, and departed with the next tide, connecting the Indus Valley to the trade networks of the Arabian Sea and beyond. The evidence of trade is vast and varied. Indus Valley goods have been found at archaeological sites throughout the Persian Gulf, in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, and along the coast of Oman and the Arabian Peninsula. Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from the Akkadian and Ur-III periods, roughly 2300 to 2000 years before the Common Era, contain references to merchants and goods from a place called Meluha. They describe Meluha as a land of exotic products: carnelian, timber, gold, ivory, and a substance translated as the bird of Meluha, which may have referred to the peacock or to the domestic chicken. The identification of Meluha with the Indus Valley is not certain, but it is widely accepted among scholars, and if correct, it means the Indus Valley had a recognized name and a known reputation among its trading partners. It was not an unknown land, it was a famous source of wealth. Let us consider what that means in terms people can feel. If you were to walk from one end of the Indus Valley territory to the other, traveling from the mountain passes of Afghanistan to the coastal ports of Gujarat, at a pace of 30 kilometers per day, it would take you well over a month. You would cross deserts, river plains, forested highlands, and coastal marshes. You would ford rivers and climb hills. You would pass through hundreds of settlements. And everywhere you went, you would find the same bricks, the same weights, the same style of pottery, the same system of drainage. The uniformity is almost eerie over that enormous distance across vastly different landscapes, different climates, different agricultural regimes. The Indus Valley people maintained a degree of cultural consistency that has few parallels in the ancient world. Even the bead styles were consistent, even the shapes of storage jars, even the proportions of door frames. It is as if an invisible hand coordinated every aspect of material life across a territory the size of a modern nation. The numbers are worth dwelling on because they reveal the true scale of what disappeared. At its peak, which scientific estimates place between roughly 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization may have been home to 5 million people. Some researchers, including the archaeologist Rita Wright, have placed the estimate even higher suggesting that the total population of the Greater Indus region during this period could have reached as many as 10 million. Even the conservative estimate of 5 million is extraordinary. During the same period, the entire population of ancient Egypt was perhaps 1 to 2 million. Mesopotamia held a similar number. The Indus Valley likely contained the largest single concentration of human beings anywhere on the planet at that time. 1 in every 10 people alive may have been an Indus Valley citizen. Let that comparison settle, 1 in 10. In a world of scattered farming communities and small city-states, the Indus Valley civilization was a demographic giant, a concentration of human life and cooperative effort that would not be equaled in that region for millennia. Consider that against the backdrop of a single human life. A person born in Mohenjo-Daro around 2,500 years before the Common Era might have lived to be 50 or 60 years old if fortunate. Skeletal analysis suggests that the average life expectancy was somewhat lower, perhaps 35 to 45 years, with significant variation based on nutrition, disease, and social status. That person would have known a city of perhaps 40,000 inhabitants, with paved streets, indoor plumbing, and a centralized granary large enough to feed the population through a bad harvest. They would have worn cotton garments, because the Indus Valley people are among the earliest known cultivators and weavers of cotton, a technology that would not reach Europe for another 2,000 years. They would have adorned themselves with beads of carnelian, lapis lazuli, agate, and gold, materials sourced from as far away as present-day Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia. They would have eaten wheat and barley, peas and sesame, dates and melons. They would have known the taste of chicken, because the Indus Valley is one of the earliest known sites of chicken domestication. That person would have used standardized weights made of chert, a hard stone carefully shaped into precise cubes for trade, and the weights followed a consistent mathematical system based on ratios of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64, a binary-like progression that reveals a deep mathematical sophistication. The smallest weight found is approximately 0.86 grams. The system scales up through precisely doubled increments to weights of over 11 kilograms. This system was uniform across the entire civilization. A merchant in Harappa and a merchant in Lothal, separated by over 1,000 kilometers, used identical weights. They could trade with confidence because they shared a common standard. There is another aspect of Indus Valley life that deserves attention, because it tells us something important about the kind of society these people built. The residential areas of the major cities show a surprising degree of equality, at least in material terms. There are larger houses and smaller houses, certainly, but the difference between the largest and the smallest is modest compared to the gulf between palace and hovel that characterizes contemporary civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Almost every house in Mohenjo-Daro had access to a well or was within easy walking distance of one. Almost every house had its own bathing platform and its own drain. Almost every house was built of the same quality of brick, using the same proportions, following the same basic construction techniques. There were no grand palaces towering over humble slums. There were no massive temples dwarfing the domestic architecture around them. The impression, and it is only an impression since we cannot read their records, is of a society that distributed the benefits of urban life more broadly and more evenly than most other ancient civilizations managed to do. Whether this reflects a genuine egalitarian ethic or simply the limitations of the archaeological record is impossible to determine. But the contrast with Egypt, where the pharaoh's tomb at Giza required the labor of tens of thousands of workers and consumed resources on a monumental scale, while ordinary Egyptians lived in modest mud brick houses, is striking and suggestive. Even the treatment of the dead in the Indus Valley reflects this relative equality. Indus Valley burials are simple. The dead were typically laid in rectangular pits, extended on their backs, with a modest collection of grave goods. A few ceramic pots, some personal ornaments, perhaps a copper mirror. There are no royal tombs. There are no burial chambers filled with treasure and golden artifacts. There are no sacrifice servants accompanying their master into the afterlife. The Indus Valley dead were buried with dignity, but without display, each one receiving more or less the same treatment regardless of whatever social distinctions may have existed during life. The contrast with contemporary civilizations is telling. The royal cemetery of Ur in Mesopotamia, dating to roughly the same period as the mature Indus Valley, contained tombs of breathtaking richness with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and the bodies of dozens of attendants killed to serve their rulers in death. Nothing remotely comparable has been found at any Indus Valley site. What kind of civilization builds great cities, manages international trade, standardizes its weights and measures across a territory larger than any other civilization of its age, and yet does not build palaces, does not erect statues of its leaders, does not bury its elite with extravagant treasures? This question, unanswerable with current evidence, haunts every scholar who studies the Indus Valley. It suggests a form of social organization that we do not fully understand, one that does not fit the models derived from Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, or any other ancient civilization we know well. The Indus Valley may have been unique, and the uniqueness of what it was makes the loss of what it knew all the more painful. The math is striking. The Indus Valley civilization lasted, according to current estimates, for approximately 700 to 800 years in its mature phase, and considerably longer if we include its earlier developmental stages, known as the Early Harappan period, which may extend the total span to well over 1,000 years. The Egyptian civilization, from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, lasted roughly 3,000 years. The Roman Empire, from the founding of the city through the fall of Constantinople, lasted about 2,200 years, or about 1,000 years in the West alone. 700 years is not short. It is longer than the entire history of the United States of America. It is longer than the Ottoman Empire's rule over the Middle East. It is longer than the span from the European Renaissance to the present day. 700 years of cities, trade, craft production, and organized life, and then dissolution. But here is where the story diverges from the familiar pattern of rise and fall that we know from other civilizations. Egypt fell to foreign conquest, absorbed into the Persian, Greek, and then Roman worlds. But Egypt's story survived. The hieroglyphics were eventually deciphered. The king lists were recovered. The temples and tombs spoke volumes about the beliefs and ambitions of their builders. Rome collapsed under the weight of military overreach, internal corruption, economic strain, and external pressure from migrating peoples. But Rome's story survived too. Latin continued to be spoken and written. Roman law influenced European legal systems for centuries. The ruins of Roman cities remained visible and recognizable throughout the medieval period. These are stories we know. They involve armies, treaties, named kings and generals, written accounts of battles won and lost. The narrative, however tragic, is legible. It can be read. The Indus Valley civilization has no such narrative. There is no record of invasion that destroyed it. There is no evidence of a great war that ended it. There are no conquest inscriptions from foreign kings boasting of their victory over Indus cities. There is no sudden layer of destruction in the archaeological record. No charred timbers from burned buildings. No mass graves of battle victims. No hastily built fortifications. The cities were not sacked. They were not burned. They were, as far as the archaeological record can tell, simply left behind. Slowly, gradually, over the span of several generations, people stopped maintaining the drains. Houses fell into disrepair. Great public buildings were subdivided into smaller, cruder dwellings. The fine pottery became coarse. The long-distance trade networks contracted. And then the cities emptied. The people moved on, somewhere, and the dust settled over everything they had built. Consider what this means for the practice of archaeology. When archaeologists excavate a site that was destroyed by violence, the evidence is vivid and unambiguous. Charred timbers speak of fire. Scattered weapons speak of battle. Bodies in unnatural positions speak of massacre. The destruction layer is dramatic, readable, narrative. It tells a story. But when archaeologists excavate a site that was simply abandoned, the evidence is ambiguous, subtle, and frustratingly open to interpretation. There is no destruction layer. There is a gradual thinning. Fewer artifacts per layer. Simpler artifacts. Cruder construction. The material culture does not end with a bang. It fades, like music growing softer until it can no longer be distinguished from silence. This pattern of gradual fading rather than sudden ending is visible not just in the architecture, but in the artifacts themselves. The pottery of the mature Indus Valley period is fine, well-fired, and often painted with geometric designs or images of animals and plants. The pottery of the late and post-urban periods is coarser, thicker-walled, less carefully finished, and almost never painted. The shift is not abrupt, it is incremental. Each generation's pottery is slightly worse than the last, as if the standards of craftsmanship were slowly relaxing, as if the knowledge of how to produce the finest ware was being transmitted with decreasing fidelity. The same pattern appears in the manufacture of stone tools, in the production of terracotta figurines, in the making of jewelry and personal ornaments. Everything gets simpler, everything gets cruder. The range of materials narrows as distant sources of raw materials become inaccessible and only local resources remain available. The diversity of forms decreases as specialized shapes and styles give way to a smaller number of generic, all-purpose types. The process is not one of destruction but of simplification, a steady shedding of complexity, like a tree dropping its leaves in autumn, one at a time, until the branches are bare. At the site of Dholavira in Gujarat, the sequence is particularly instructive. The city went through 7 distinct phases of occupation, spanning roughly 1,500 years. During the middle phases, the city was a thriving urban center with monumental architecture, elaborate water reservoirs, a possible signboard that may contain the longest known Indus inscription, and all the hallmarks of a prosperous and well-organized community. Then, around 1900 years before the Common Era, the city appears to have been temporarily abandoned. When people returned, the character of the settlement had changed. The monumental buildings were no longer maintained to their former standard. New construction was more modest, the population was smaller. The city lingered on for several more centuries, but it was a shadow of its former self, a memory of grandeur living in diminished quarters. The archaeologist Jonathan Mark Kanoya, who has spent decades excavating at Harappa and is one of the leading authorities on the Indus Valley civilization, has described the decline not as a collapse, but as a transformation. In his view, the Indus Valley did not fall, it changed. The urban phase gave way to a post-urban phase in which many of the same populations continued to live in the same general regions but organized their lives differently. The grand experiment of large-scale urbanism was over. The people returned to a more dispersed, more localized, more village-oriented way of life. The great cities were abandoned not because their inhabitants were killed or driven out, but because the economic and environmental conditions that had made those cities viable no longer existed. Something is profoundly wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations end. We expect catastrophe. We expect drama. We expect a final battle, a last stand, a moment we can point to and say, this is where it ended. The Indus Valley denies us that satisfaction. It offers instead a slow, quiet unraveling, a civilizational sigh rather than a scream. And that silence, that absence of a clear ending, is precisely what makes it so disturbing. To study the Indus Valley is to confront the limits of archaeology itself. Without a deciphered script, without written histories, without king lists, or temple records, or annalistic accounts, we are left reading the story of a civilization through its material remains alone. Every interpretation is provisional. Every theory is built on inference and analogy. We know what they built, but not why. We know what they traded, but not what they believed about commerce. We know how they arranged their cities, but not how they governed them or what laws they followed. The Indus Valley civilization is like a vast, intricate machine whose purpose we cannot determine because the instruction manual was written in a language no one alive can read. And this brings us to the central question, the one that has haunted archaeologists for over a century, the one that wakes researchers at night and fills conference rooms with arguments. What happened? What force? What event? What slow catastrophe could erase a civilization of 5 million people from the map and from memory? How does the largest urban civilization of its era simply stop? The answers that have been proposed are numerous. Some are plausible, some are desperate, some are brilliant, and some are wrong. None are certain. But what scientists discovered as they dug deeper into the ruins was worse than anyone expected. The problem with the Indus Valley civilization is not just that it vanished. The problem is that it vanished in a way that violates nearly everything we think we understand about how complex societies work. It defied the patterns. It broke the rules. It did something that civilizations are not supposed to do, which is to dissolve peacefully, completely, and without leaving a single readable explanation for why. Let us start with what we know. The mature phase of the civilization, the period of its greatest cities and most sophisticated material culture, is generally dated by scientific estimates to between approximately 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era. During this window of roughly 7 centuries, the Indus Valley people built and maintained a network of urban centers and smaller settlements that functioned with a remarkable degree of coordination. The bricks were standardized, not just within individual cities, but across the entire civilization. A brick made in Harappa in the north had the same proportions as a brick made in Lothal on the Gujarat coast, over 1,000 kilometers to the south. The weights were standardized, following the same binary progression across all known sites. The drainage systems followed consistent engineering principles. The pottery showed recognizable stylistic patterns that evolved in parallel across widely separated communities. This was not a loose confederation of independent villages that happened to share some cultural traits. This was a civilization that had solved, on a massive scale, the fundamental problems of urban life: water supply, waste removal, food storage, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. And yet, conspicuously, jarringly, it appears to have done all of this without the apparatus of centralized power that we associate with every other early civilization. There are no palaces. There are no royal tombs filled with gold and sacrificed servants, as were found in Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are no monumental statues of kings or gods gazing imperiously over their subjects. There are no fortified citadels bristling with weapons. There is no obvious administrative center, no throne room, no audience hall. The architecture is civic, not royal. The buildings are functional, not grandiose. There are granaries, which suggest organized food distribution. There are workshops, which suggest coordinated craft production. There are large bathing facilities, which suggest communal ritual. But there is nothing that screams power in the way that the pyramids of Giza scream power, or the way that the ziggurats of Mesopotamia scream power. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro is the closest thing to a monumental public building that has been found, and even that is modest by the standards of contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is an impressive piece of hydraulic engineering, certainly, but it is not a pyramid. It is not a temple complex rising to the heavens. It is a pool, a very well-built pool, with fine craftsmanship and careful waterproofing, but a pool nonetheless. The pyramids of Giza were being built during the same centuries that Mohenjo-Daro flourished. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Nothing in the Indus Valley approaches that scale of monumental display. Nothing comes close. This absence has puzzled scholars since the beginning of Indus Valley studies. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, the forceful, charismatic British archaeologist who excavated at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the 1940s, proposed that the civilization was governed by a priestly ruling class, a theocracy that maintained order through religious authority rather than military force. He based this partly on the discovery of the so-called priest king, a small soapstone bust found at Mohenjo-Daro, depicting a bearded man wearing a decorated headband and a cloak covered with a trefoil or 3-leafed clover pattern. The figure's eyes are half closed, his expression serene, his bearing regal. Wheeler saw in this figure evidence of a powerful religious elite that ruled through spiritual authority. The name Priest King stuck, and it shaped interpretation of the Indus Valley for decades. But subsequent scholars have questioned this interpretation on multiple grounds. The bust is small, only about 17.5 centimeters tall. It was found in a relatively modest context, not in a great temple or a palace, but in an ordinary building. The designation priest king is entirely modern. There is no evidence that the figure depicted was either a priest or a king. He may have been a merchant, a craftsman, a storyteller, or a figure from a narrative we will never know. We have imposed our expectations of hierarchical power onto an object that may represent something entirely different, something we lack the cultural framework to understand. More recent theories have proposed that the Indus Valley Civilization may have been governed by some form of collective decision-making, perhaps a council of elders, a merchant oligarchy, or a consensus-based system that distributed power broadly rather than concentrating it in a single ruler. The archaeologist Gregory Possehl argued for a system he called faceless power, authority exercised through institutions rather than individuals, through shared norms rather than personal command. This would explain the absence of palatial architecture and royal self-glorification. It would also explain the remarkable uniformity of urban planning across the civilization's vast territory. If no single ruler was imposing their vision from the top down, then the consistency must have emerged from shared cultural norms, agreed upon standards, a kind of civilizational common sense that the entire population followed, because the entire population agreed it worked. But here is the problem. If this is true, it means the Indus Valley Civilization represents something almost unique in human history. A large-scale, urbanized, technologically sophisticated society that functioned without the coercive machinery of kingship, empire, or military domination. And that, in turn, makes its collapse even more mysterious. Because if it was not held together by force, then it was not undone by the failure of force. If there was no central authority to overthrow, then there was no revolution, no coup, no succession crisis that could bring the whole system down. The usual explanations for civilizational collapse, the ones that work reasonably well for Rome, for the Maya, for the Khmer, for the Ottoman Empire, simply do not apply. The mystery deepens when we examine the archaeological evidence from the period of decline, the centuries after 1900, before the Common Era, when the cities began to change and the civilization began to unravel. At Mohenjo-Daro, the careful urban grid started to break down. Houses were built over former streets, blocking circulation. New walls were erected across old doorways. The drainage system fell into disrepair, with channels filling with silt and refuse that was no longer being cleared. Large public buildings were subdivided into smaller rooms, suggesting that what had once been communal or institutional spaces were being converted into more private, perhaps more desperate, living quarters. The quality of pottery declined markedly, with crude, poorly fired vessels replacing the fine, painted wares of the mature period. The distinctive Indus seals, those small carved stones bearing images of animals and the undeciphered script, became rarer and eventually disappeared from the archaeological record. Long-distance trade goods, the carnelian beads from Gujarat, the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the etched shells from the coast all began to disappear. A similar pattern appears at Harappa, though the sequence is slightly different and the timing may not be exactly parallel. At Harappa, the later phases of occupation show evidence of increasing crowding, with new structures squeezed into spaces that had previously been open. The craftsmanship declined, the material culture simplified, the interregional connections weakened, and it gets worse, because the decline was not uniform across the civilization's territory. While the great cities of the Indus and Ghaggar-Hakra river valleys were shrinking and emptying, new settlements were appearing further east, in the upper Ganges-Yamuna region, and further south, in Gujarat. These new settlements were smaller, less sophisticated, and lacked the hallmark features of mature Indus urbanism. They did not have the gridded streets. They did not have the elaborate drainage. Their pottery was cruder, their buildings less carefully constructed, their material culture simpler in every measurable way. It was as if the people who left the great cities carried with them only fragments of their former culture, pieces that degraded further with each passing generation, like a copy of a copy of a copy, each iteration losing detail and resolution until the original was unrecognizable. The archaeologist Gregory Possehl, one of the foremost scholars of the Indus Valley, spent decades studying this transition. In his landmark work, published in 2002, he argued that the decline of the Indus Valley civilization was not a single event but a process, a gradual transformation that played out over several centuries, perhaps 300 years or more. He called it de-urbanization, a term that captures the essence of what happened without attributing it to a specific cause. The people did not die. They did not disappear from the earth. They simply stopped being urban. They stopped maintaining the infrastructure, the trade networks, the standardized systems that had made their cities possible. They dispersed into smaller communities, adopted simpler ways of life, and over time, the memory of what they had been faded and was lost. But why? Why would a civilization that had thrived for 700 years suddenly begin to unravel? What changed? What broke? The most widely discussed explanation involves climate change, and the evidence for it is compelling, though not conclusive. In 2012, a team of researchers, led by Liviu Giosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that reconstructed the environmental history of the Indus Valley region over the past 12,000 years. Using satellite imagery, sediment core analysis, archaeological surveys, and geological fieldwork, Giosan and his colleagues demonstrated that the landscape inhabited by the Indus Valley people was not static. It was changing, slowly but profoundly, throughout the entire span of their civilization. The world they knew when they founded their first cities was not the same world they inhabited when they left their last ones. The key factor was water. The Indus Valley civilization depended on two major river systems, the Indus itself, which still flows today through Pakistan, and a now vanished river called the Ghaggar Hakra, which many researchers identify with the Sarasvati, a great river praised in ancient Indian texts as the mightiest of all rivers, the mother of waters. During the early and mature phases of the civilization, these river systems provided abundant water for agriculture, supporting the dense populations of the major cities. The monsoon rains replenished the rivers each year. The floodplains deposited fertile silt on the fields. The system worked, and it worked well, for centuries. But the monsoon patterns that fed these rivers were not constant. They fluctuated over centuries, shifting in intensity and timing in response to large-scale atmospheric and oceanic changes that are still not fully understood. Giosan's research showed that beginning around 5,000 years ago, the Indian summer monsoon began to weaken. Rainfall decreased across the region. The rivers that had sustained the civilization began to diminish. The Ghaggar Hakra, which may once have been fed by Himalayan glacial meltwater as well as monsoon rain, gradually lost its flow. It became seasonal, flowing only during the wettest months. Then it became intermittent, flowing only in particularly wet years. Then it went dry. Settlements along its banks, many of which were among the largest and most important in the Indus Valley network, were left without reliable water. The significance of the Ghaggar Hakra cannot be overstated. Recent surveys have identified over 500 Indus Valley sites along the banks of this now dry river system, more than along the Indus itself. Some of the largest known sites, including the massive settlement of Ganwariwala in the Cholistan Desert, were located on the Ghaggar Hakra. When the river dried, these sites did not merely lose a convenience, they lost the fundamental precondition of their existence. A city of 20 or 30,000 people cannot survive without a reliable water source. The wells can supplement, the stored rainwater can bridge a dry season, but without the river, the agricultural base that feeds the city collapses. And when the agricultural base collapses, the city follows. The Ghaggar Hakra today is a ghost river. Its ancient channel can be traced from satellite imagery, a pale scar across the landscape of the Thar Desert and the plains of Haryana and Rajasthan, visible in the colour differences of the soil and the patterns of vegetation. In places, the channel is still marked by a slight depression in the terrain, a geological memory of flowing water. In the monsoon season, small amounts of rainwater sometimes collect in these depressions, forming temporary pools that dry up within weeks. It is a haunting sight, this trace of a river that once sustained millions, reduced to a seasonal puddle in the desert sand. This did not happen overnight. The drying was a process that unfolded over centuries, perhaps over 500 years or more. But its effects were cumulative. Each generation faced slightly worse conditions than the one before. Fields that had once produced surplus grain began to yield less. Pastures that had once supported large herds began to thin. Cities that had once been centers of production and trade became harder to sustain. The elaborate urban infrastructure, the drains, the baths, the granaries, all of it depended on a surplus that was slowly evaporating along with the rivers. Without surplus grain, you cannot feed specialist craftspeople. Without specialist craftspeople, you cannot maintain the infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you cannot support an urban population. The system was circular, and when any link weakened, the whole circle contracted. Other researchers have added layers to this picture. A team led by Yama Dixit of the University of Cambridge published a study in 2014 analysing sediment cores from a lake called Kotla Dahar in Haryana, northern India. The cores provided a detailed record of moisture conditions in the region over the past 6,000 years. What they revealed was striking. The lake, which had been full of water for millennia, experienced a dramatic decline in water levels beginning around 4,100 years ago. The sediments shifted from those characteristic of a deep lake to those characteristic of a shallow, evaporating pool. The lake effectively dried up. This timing coincides closely with the period of most rapid urban decline in the Indus Valley. The megadrought, as some researchers have called it, was real, and it hit the Indus Valley region during its most vulnerable period. The picture that emerges is of a civilization caught in a slow environmental vice. The monsoons weakened, the rivers shrank, the rains became less reliable, and a society that had been built on the assumption of abundant water found itself facing a world in which water was scarce. The very foundation on which the civilization rested was crumbling, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly, over the course of generations. But here is the problem with the climate explanation, and it is a significant one. Climate change does not automatically destroy civilizations. Throughout history, societies have adapted to changing environments. They have built irrigation systems, dug canals, developed drought-resistant crops, moved to new locations with better resources. Ancient Egyptian civilization survived periods of severe drought by intensifying its management of the Nile. Mesopotamian cities adapted to changing river courses by building extensive canal networks. The Indus Valley people were among the most skilled hydraulic engineers of their age. Their entire urban infrastructure was built around the management of water, the collection, distribution, and disposal of water. If anyone should have been able to adapt to changing rainfall patterns, it was them. So why did they not adapt? Why did a people who had mastered the control of water in their cities fail to control the water in their rivers and in the sky? One possible answer is that they did adapt, but that the adaptation itself destroyed the civilization. This is the argument put forward by researchers who focus on the eastward migration of Indus Valley populations. As the western rivers dried up, people moved east toward the Ganges-Yamuna Doab, where rainfall was more reliable and river flows were stronger. They did not die, they relocated. But in relocating, they left behind the urban density that had made their civilization possible. Without large cities, there was no need for the standardized bricks, the elaborate drains, the long-distance trade networks, the specialized workshops. The technology and infrastructure that had defined the Indus Valley civilization were not destroyed by an enemy or erased by a flood. They were simply rendered unnecessary by a population that had spread too thin to sustain them. This is a deeply unsettling idea. It suggests that civilizations can die not from catastrophe, but from diffusion. Not from a blow, but from a slow dissolving, like salt scattered across a field, each grain intact, but no longer part of anything whole. The individual survived. The community survived. The culture, in diminished form, survived. But the civilization, the complex, interconnected, self-sustaining system that had been more than the sum of its parts, did not. There is a concept in systems theory called the minimum viable complexity. It describes the level of interconnection, specialization, and scale below which a complex system can no longer maintain itself. A modern hospital, for example, cannot function with fewer than a certain number of specialized staff, a certain volume of patients, a certain supply chain of equipment and medications. Below that threshold, the hospital ceases to function as a hospital and becomes something else: a clinic, a first aid station, a building with beds. The same principle may apply to civilizations. The Indus Valley civilization had a minimum viable complexity that required large urban populations, long-distance trade connections, specialized craft workshops, coordinated agricultural production, and maintained infrastructure. When the environmental changes of the early second millennium before the Common Era pushed the population below the threshold needed to sustain all of these systems simultaneously, the civilization dropped below its minimum viable complexity and collapsed into a simpler mode of organization. Not death but devolution, not extinction but simplification. And in simplification, the highest order achievements, the writing, the engineering, the artistic traditions, the coordinated urban planning, were the first things lost because they were the most dependent on the complex conditions that no longer existed. The archaeologist Joseph Tainter, in his influential study of societal collapse, published in 1988, argued that complex societies collapse when the costs of maintaining complexity exceed the benefits. As a society grows more complex, it requires increasing investments of energy and resources to maintain its institutions, its infrastructure, and its administrative apparatus. At some point, the returns on this investment begin to diminish. Additional complexity produces fewer and fewer benefits while demanding more and more resources. When the society reaches a point where simpler alternatives become more attractive than continued complexity, it collapses, not because it fails, but because collapse becomes the rational choice. People choose simplicity over the burden of maintaining a system that no longer serves them well enough to justify its costs. Applied to the Indus Valley, Tainter's framework suggests that as environmental conditions deteriorated, the costs of maintaining the urban system rose while the benefits declined. Maintaining the drains, the granaries, the trade networks, the standardized production systems, all of this required effort, organization, and resources. When the rivers were flowing and the harvests were good, the benefits justified the costs. When the rivers dried and the harvests failed, the equation shifted. The urban system became a burden rather than a benefit, and the people made the rational, if tragic, choice to let it go. Other theories have been proposed over the decades, each capturing a different facet of the puzzle. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, in the 1940s, argued that the Indus Valley civilization was destroyed by an Aryan invasion, nomadic warriors from Central Asia who swept through the mountain passes and conquered the peaceful urban dwellers of the plains. Wheeler pointed to groups of skeletons found in the upper levels of Mohenjo-Daro as evidence of a final massacre. This theory was enormously influential for decades and became deeply entangled with broader debates about the origins of Indian civilization, debates that remain politically charged to this day. But modern archaeology has largely abandoned Wheeler's invasion theory. The skeletons he cited have been re-examined and found to date from different periods, not from a single violent event. There is no consistent evidence of military destruction across the Indus Valley sites. No weaponry stockpiles, no defensive fortifications built in haste, no widespread burning, no layers of ash. The invasion theory has not survived scrutiny. A more recent theory involves tectonic activity. The Indus Valley sits in a seismically active region, part of the zone where the Indian tectonic plate collides with the Eurasian plate, the same collision that created the Himalayan mountain range. Some researchers have proposed that major earthquakes may have altered the courses of rivers, disrupting the water supply to key cities. There is geological evidence that the course of the Indus River shifted significantly during the period of Indus Valley decline, and that at least one major tributary, the Beas, may have been captured by another river system. This is plausible. River capture is a real geological phenomenon, but it explains only part of the picture. An earthquake or a river shift might destroy one city or devastate one region. It does not explain the simultaneous decline of a civilization spread across 1.3 million square kilometers. Disease has also been proposed as a factor. The dense, interconnected urban centers of the Indus Valley would have been vulnerable to epidemic disease, particularly in a period of environmental stress when nutrition was declining and water quality was deteriorating. There is some skeletal evidence of malaria and other infectious diseases at Indus Valley sites. But disease alone does not erase a civilization's memory. It does not cause a script to be forgotten. Plagues have swept through many societies throughout history without permanently destroying them. Europe lost somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population to the Black Death in the 14th century and recovered within a few generations. The population declined, but the knowledge, the institutions, the cultural frameworks survived. Each explanation captures a piece of the truth. None captures the whole. The climate changed. The rivers shifted. The monsoons weakened. The people migrated. The cities emptied. Perhaps disease accelerated the process. Perhaps earthquakes disrupted critical infrastructure. But the deeper question remains unanswered. The question that keeps scholars awake and fills volumes of academic debate. Why was the cultural knowledge not preserved? Why did the script fall out of use? Why did the architectural traditions, the trade networks, the standardized systems of weight and measurement all vanish so completely that no subsequent civilization in the region retained any conscious trace of them? But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Indus Valley civilization did not just disappear, it was forgotten. So thoroughly forgotten that when its cities were finally uncovered in the 1920s, no one in the region had any memory that such a civilization had ever existed. 4,000 years of silence. 4,000 years during which the largest urban culture of its age lay buried under the feet of people who had no idea it was there. Farmers ploughed fields over its streets. Villages were built on mounds that concealed its buildings. Rivers flowed over its harbours, and nobody knew. Nobody remembered. The forgetting was total. The disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization is not an isolated event. It belongs to a broader pattern, a disturbing recurring theme in human history that becomes more unsettling the more examples one examines. Civilizations rise, flourish, develop sophisticated technologies and complex social systems, and then collapse, sometimes leaving so little behind that their very existence is disputed by later generations. To understand what happened in the Indus Valley, we need to examine this pattern in its full scope, to look at the other great vanishings and see what they can teach us about the fragility of human achievement. Each case offers a different angle, a different theory, a different piece of the puzzle, and each case ultimately reveals the limitations of our explanations. Consider first the ancestral Puebloans, the people once known by the Navajo word Anasazi, a term sometimes translated as ancient enemies or ancient ones, though the translation is debated, and the name is now considered insensitive by many Pueblo peoples. For roughly 7 centuries, from approximately 550 to 1250 of the Common Era, the ancestral Puebloans built a remarkable civilization in the canyons, mesas, and river valleys of what is now the American Southwest, primarily in the Four Corners region where the modern states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. Their architecture was extraordinary, progressing from simple pit houses dug into the earth to elaborate multi-story stone complexes built into cliff faces and canyon walls. At Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, they constructed great houses, massive multi-story stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, oriented with astronomical precision so that doorways and windows aligned with the solstice sunrise or the moonrise at its most extreme northern point. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of these great houses, contained over 600 rooms and stood 4 stories high. Its semicircular floor plan covered an area of approximately 1.8 hectares. The construction required the transport of over 200,000 wooden beams from forests located 50 to 80 kilometers away, carried by hand across desert terrain without the use of wheeled vehicles or draft animals. Roads, carefully engineered and perfectly straight, cutting through hills and across gullies rather than following the natural contours of the land, radiated from Chaco Canyon across the desert landscape for distances of up to 65 kilometers, connecting outlying communities to the central complex. The labor required for all of this was enormous. The social organization required to coordinate it was sophisticated. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the architecture was precise. This was not a primitive culture. This was a civilization that could mobilize hundreds of workers, manage long-distance supply chains, and maintain architectural standards across a wide territory. Then, in the late 1200s, the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their canyon homes. They left behind their great houses, their kivas, their carefully built roads, their cliff dwellings. They moved south and east to the Rio Grande Valley and to locations in central and western New Mexico and Arizona, where they built new communities and established the Pueblo cultures that persist to this day. But they never returned to Chaco Canyon. The great houses fell silent, the roads led nowhere. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, some of the most spectacular ancient structures in North America, structures built with immense effort into the faces of sandstone cliffs, accessible only by climbing hand-carved toe holes in the rock, were left empty, their rooms slowly filling with dust and bat droppings and the debris of centuries. The most widely accepted explanation involves drought. Tree ring records from the region, which provide a year-by-year record of rainfall going back over 2,000 years, show a severe dry period lasting from approximately 1276 to 1299 of the Common Era. This 23-year drought, sometimes called the Great Drought, would have devastated the dry farming agriculture on which the ancestral Puebloans depended. Without reliable rain, crops failed. Without crops, the population could not be sustained. Without a sustainable population, the great houses and the social systems they represented could not be maintained. But drought alone does not explain the totality of the abandonment. The ancestral Puebloans had survived earlier droughts, including one in the mid-1100s that was nearly as severe. Something else had changed. Many researchers now believe that by the late 1200s, the social and political systems that had held the Chaco-centered communities together had already been weakened, perhaps by internal conflict, by growing inequality, by the strain of supporting a population that had outgrown its resource base, or by a loss of faith in the religious and ceremonial systems that had provided social cohesion. The environmental crisis may have been the final trigger, but the vulnerability was already there. The drought did not break a healthy system. It broke a system that was already cracking. The parallels with the Indus Valley are striking and instructive. A sophisticated civilization dependent on a specific environmental regime, a slow shift in climatic conditions, a population that responds not by adapting in place, but by dispersing, a material culture that does not survive the dispersal in its original form. The ancestral Puebloans, like the Indus Valley people, did not go extinct. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Laguna, and others who carry forward traditions and cultural memories from the ancestral period. But the great houses of Chaco Canyon were never rebuilt. The engineering knowledge that created them was not passed on in the same form. Something was lost in the transition, and what was lost was precisely the complexity, the scale, the ambition that had defined the civilization at its peak. The people survived, the civilization did not. Now consider the Khmer Empire, and the story becomes even more instructive. For 6 centuries, from approximately 800 to 1400 of the Common Era, the Khmer ruled a vast domain in mainland Southeast Asia, from their capital at Angkor, in what is now the Siem Reap province of Cambodia. Angkor was one of the largest pre-industrial cities ever built. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, it may have covered an area of over 1,000 square kilometers and supported a population of 700,000 to 1 million people. For comparison, London in the 13th century had a population of roughly 80,000. Paris had perhaps 200,000. Angkor was not just larger, it was of a completely different order of magnitude. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II, remains the largest religious monument on the planet. Its moat alone is 190 meters wide and stretches for 5.5 kilometers in circumference. Its central tower rises 65 meters above the surrounding plain. The walls of the temple are covered with bas-reliefs depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, battle narratives, and the daily life of the Khmer court, stretching for over 800 meters and constituting one of the longest continuous bas-relief panels in the world. The construction is estimated to have required the labor of thousands of workers over a period of roughly 37 years. The Khmer were master hydraulic engineers, and this is where the comparison with the Indus Valley becomes especially pointed. They built an elaborate system of reservoirs, called barrays, and canals that captured monsoon rains and distributed water across the landscape for wet rice oil cultivation. The West Brae, the largest of these reservoirs, measured approximately 8 kilometers by 2.3 kilometers and could hold an estimated 53 million cubic meters of water. The East Barray was smaller but still enormous, measuring 7.5 kilometers by 1.8 kilometers. A network of canals, channels, and smaller reservoirs connected these great basins to the rice paddies that fed the city's population. This water management system was the foundation of the Khmer economy. It enabled 2 or even 3 rice harvests per year, producing the enormous surplus that supported the urban population, the monumental building programs, and the elaborate court culture that made Angkor one of the wonders of the medieval world. And then, beginning in the 14th century, the Khmer Empire began to decline. The capital was attacked repeatedly by the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya. The water management system fell into disrepair. Canals silted up. Reservoirs leaked. The intricate balance of water flows that had sustained the city for centuries was disrupted. The population dwindled. The great temples were abandoned, one by one, to the encroaching forest. By the 16th century, Angkor was largely empty, its towers rising above the jungle canopy like the bones of a dead giant. When French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited the site in 1860, he found a city of stone being slowly consumed by the roots of enormous fig and silk cotton trees. The trees had grown into the very fabric of the buildings, their roots threading through walls and doorways, lifting stone blocks with the slow, inexorable force of growth. His account, published posthumously, introduced Angkor to the Western world as a lost city in the jungle. The cause of Angkor's decline is now understood to involve a combination of factors that echo the Indus Valley story in troubling ways. Research published by the Greater Angkor Project, a collaboration led by scholars from the University of Sydney, has shown that the Khmer water management system was more fragile than it appeared. Decades of expansion and modification had created a network of dependencies so complex that any significant disruption, whether from extreme flooding, prolonged drought, or simple maintenance failures, could cascade through the entire system. The system had no resilience. It could function beautifully under normal conditions, but it could not absorb shocks. Climate data from tree rings and sediment cores suggests that the 14th and 15th centuries saw unusual monsoon variability in mainland Southeast Asia, with periods of intense flooding followed by severe drought. The hydraulic infrastructure, already stressed by centuries of use and modification, could not handle these extremes. Floods damaged canal banks and reservoir walls. Droughts left fields without water. The cascading failures degraded the agricultural output that supported the urban population. People left. The maintenance workforce shrank. More infrastructure failed. More people left. The cycle fed on itself. But here is the problem. The Khmer were among the most skilled water engineers in human history. They had managed one of the most complex hydraulic systems ever built for over 500 years. If they could not sustain their system through environmental change, what hope did any ancient civilization have? And if the Indus Valley people, who were equally skilled in water management, faced a similar environmental challenge, is it any surprise that they too failed to adapt? The numbers are striking. Angkor at its peak may have had a population rivaling or exceeding that of any contemporary European city. The Khmer managed a territory of over 500,000 square kilometers. They built temples that have endured for nearly 1,000 years, structures so massive and so beautifully constructed that they still draw millions of visitors annually. And yet their civilization collapsed within a century or two, their capital consumed by forest, their population reduced to a fraction of its former size, their administrative and engineering knowledge largely lost. The knowledge that built Angkor Wat survived in the memories of Buddhist monks who continued to worship at some of the temples, but the engineering expertise that created the water system the administrative capacity that managed a city of nearly 1 million people, the artistic traditions that produced those 800 meters of bas-reliefs, these were diminished and transformed beyond recognition within a few generations. Turn now to the Sea Peoples, one of the most enigmatic chapters in all of ancient history. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean were struck by a wave of destruction so sudden and so comprehensive that historians have given it a name: the Late Bronze Age Collapse. Within a span of perhaps 50 years, an entire world ended. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled much of Anatolia and parts of Syria, and had rivaled Egypt in power and prestige, was destroyed so thoroughly that its capital, Hattusa, was burned and never reoccupied. The palace economies of Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the heroes of Homer, were reduced to ruins. The Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and elsewhere were burned and abandoned. The coastal cities of the Levant, including the great trading centre of Ugarit, were sacked and left in ashes. Egypt survived, but barely, and the new kingdom never fully recovered its former power. An entire interconnected system of kingdoms, trade routes, and diplomatic relationships that had functioned for centuries was shattered within a single human lifetime. The Egyptian records blame a confederation of mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples. Pharaoh Ramesses III, who fought them in a great naval battle around 1178 before the Common Era, left detailed reliefs on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, depicting the battle and naming several of the attacking groups: the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. The reliefs show ships locked in combat, warriors falling into the sea, and the pharaoh himself standing triumphant over his enemies. But who these people actually were, where they came from, and why they attacked remains a matter of fierce and unresolved scholarly debate after more than a century of research. Some may have been displaced populations from the Aegean or Western Anatolia, set in motion by famines or political upheavals. Some may have been peoples from Sicily or Sardinia. Some may have been former subjects of the very kingdoms they destroyed. The historian Eric Klein, in his widely read book published in 2014, argued that the Late Bronze Age collapse was not caused by the Sea Peoples alone. The Sea Peoples were a symptom, not a cause. The real killer was systemic failure. Klein argued that the Bronze Age kingdoms had built an international system so tightly integrated, so dependent on the smooth functioning of every link in the chain, that the failure of any single element could bring the whole structure down. Earthquake damage in one region disrupted trade. Trade disruption caused shortages in another region. Shortages caused famine. Famine caused social unrest. Social unrest caused political instability. Political instability weakened military defences. Weakened defences invited attack. Attack caused more destruction. And the cycle spiraled downward until the system collapsed entirely. The parallel to the Indus Valley is imperfect but deeply instructive. The Indus Valley civilization was not destroyed by external invaders, as far as we know, but it was, like the Bronze Age kingdoms, a system of interlinked dependencies. The standardized bricks required organized production and distribution. The drainage systems required coordinated maintenance by trained workers. The long-distance trade networks required stable routes, reliable partners, and standardized measures. The surplus agriculture required consistent rainfall and functioning irrigation. If any of these systems faltered, the others would be affected, and if enough of them faltered simultaneously, whether because of drought, river shifts, disease, or simply the accumulated weight of centuries of stress, the entire civilization could enter a spiral of decline from which recovery was impossible. Not because the people lacked the ability to recover, but because recovery required the very systems that were failing. Let us now turn to Göbekli Tepe, the site that has arguably done more to destabilize our understanding of early human history than any other discovery in the past half-century. Located in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Sanliurfa, on a barren hilltop overlooking the Harran Plain, Göbekli Tepe consists of a series of massive stone circles built with T-shaped pillars, weighing up to 15 tons each, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, snakes, scorpions, vultures, boars, and abstract symbols that have no clear meaning. According to scientific dating methods, the site is approximately 11,000 to 12,000 years old, making it thousands of years older than Stonehenge, thousands of years older than the pyramids, and crucially, thousands of years older than the earliest known agricultural settlements in the region. This last point is the most disruptive to established models of human history. Before Göbekli Tepe, the accepted model of human development held that agriculture came first, creating the food surpluses that allowed people to settle in permanent communities, which in turn enabled the development of complex social organization, which in turn enabled the construction of monumental architecture. This sequence, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution model, was one of the foundational assumptions of archaeological theory. Göbekli Tepe reverses it. Here was monumental architecture built by hunter-gatherers, people who had no farms, no permanent villages, no pottery, no metal tools. The labor required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect these massive stone pillars implies a degree of social organization, logistical planning, and coordinated effort that was simply not supposed to exist among pre-agricultural peoples. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations at Göbekli Tepe from 1995 until his death in 2014, estimated that building even one of the stone circles would have required a labor force of hundreds of people working over an extended period. Feeding and organizing such a workforce without agriculture requires a degree of surplus food production from hunting and gathering that challenges our assumptions about the limits of non-agricultural subsistence. And then, after perhaps 2,000 years of use, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The stone circles were carefully filled with rubble, soil, animal bones, and stones, preserving them for future millennia but also hiding them completely from view. The burial was systematic and thorough. Each circle was filled to the top of its pillars. The site was covered over and left as a bare hilltop, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Who buried it and why remains entirely unknown. Schmidt believed the burial was intentional and ritualistic, a deliberate act of closure, a funeral for a sacred place. Other researchers have proposed different explanations, but none can be confirmed. Consider what this implies. A monumental site, built with enormous effort by a population that possessed no agriculture, no pottery, no metal, was in use for roughly 2 millennia and then buried and forgotten. The people who buried it did not leave any written record explaining their decision. They did not build a replacement monument at another location, as far as we know. They simply covered it with earth and moved on. The site lay hidden for roughly 10,000 years, until a Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz noticed a carved stone protruding from a hillside in 1994 and reported it to the museum in Sanliurfa. 10,000 years of forgetting. This is a timescale that dwarfs even the 4,000-year silence of the Indus Valley, and it raises a question that should keep anyone with a historical imagination awake at night. How many other sites like Göbekli Tepe exist, still buried, still forgotten, their existence unknown because no shepherd happened to kick the right stone? Consider now the case of Cahokia, the great Native American city that once stood near the present site of St. Louis, Missouri, in the floodplain where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers converge. At its peak, around the year 1100 of the Common Era, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico. Its population is estimated to have between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city proper, with perhaps another 20 to 30,000 living in surrounding satellite communities scattered across the American bottom, the broad floodplain of the Mississippi. The total metropolitan population may have rivaled that of contemporary London. The central feature of the city was Monk's Mound, an enormous earthen platform covering over 5 hectares at its base and rising to a height of roughly 30 meters. It is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza, though far less tall. The mound was built in stages over approximately 2 centuries, with each layer carefully engineered using alternating bands of different soil types to promote drainage and structural stability. At its summit stood a large wooden building, likely the residence of Cahokia's paramount chief, or the site of important ceremonies. Cahokia was a planned city. Its central plaza, a flat open space covering over 19 hectares, was laid out on a north-south axis aligned with celestial events. A circle of large wooden posts, called Woodhenge by modern archaeologists after its superficial resemblance to the famous English stone circle, served as a solar calendar, allowing the precise tracking of solstices and equinoxes. The posts were arranged so that on the morning of the spring equinox, an observer standing at the center of the circle would see the sun rise directly behind a specific post. On the summer solstice, a different post marked the sunrise. The system required sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful measurement. The city had extensive craft workshops, massive storage pits for maize, and a social hierarchy evidenced by the dramatically differential treatment of the dead. One burial mound, called Mound 72, contained the remains of a high-status individual laid on a blanket of over 20,000 marine shell disc beads, arranged in the shape of a bird. Surrounding this central burial were the remains of over 250 other individuals, many of them young women, apparently sacrificed and buried in mass graves. Some had been buried alive, their bodies contorted in positions of struggle. Whatever political and religious system governed Cahokia, it commanded the power of life and death over its subjects. Cahokia thrived for roughly 200 years and then declined rapidly. By 1300 of the Common Era, the city was largely abandoned. The great mounds remained, enormous and undeniable, but the wooden buildings that had crowned them rotted away. The plazas reverted to grassland. The satellite communities dispersed. By the time European explorers arrived in the region, in the 16th and 17th centuries, no local population claimed Cahokia as their heritage or offered any account of who had built the mounds. The mounds were simply there, massive and mysterious, prompting wild speculation. When early European settlers encountered Monk's Mound, many attributed it to a lost race of mound builders, a vanished white civilization, or even a colony of ancient Phoenicians, unwilling to believe that the ancestors of the Native American peoples they were displacing could have built something so impressive. This racist myth persisted well into the 19th century and was only dispelled through decades of careful archaeological work. The causes of Cahokia's decline are debated, but the leading theories involve a familiar combination of environmental stress and social strain. The city's enormous population placed severe demands on the surrounding landscape. Forests were cleared for fuel and construction, leading to erosion and flooding. The concentration of people created sanitation challenges and increased vulnerability to disease. Some researchers have proposed that the deforestation of the uplands above the Mississippi floodplain led to catastrophic flooding that destroyed agricultural fields and damaged the city itself. Others point to evidence of political instability, including the construction of a massive wooden palisade around the central precinct around 1150, suggesting that the city's rulers felt threatened either by external enemies or by internal unrest. The palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times over the following decades, each time with modifications suggesting changing defensive needs. The pattern repeats, with variations in each case, but with an underlying structure that remains disturbingly consistent. A sophisticated urban centre achieves a period of remarkable flourishing. It builds monuments, develops specialized crafts, manages complex systems of food production and distribution. Then it declines, sometimes rapidly, sometimes over several generations. The population disperses. The buildings are abandoned. The specialized knowledge that built and maintained the complex systems is lost. And the forgetting begins, a forgetting so complete that within a few centuries the achievement is invisible, buried under earth or hidden by forest, its existence unknown until modern archaeologists dig it up. Let us return now to the Indus script, because it is here that the Indus Valley mystery reaches its deepest and most frustrating point. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been found at Indus Valley sites across the subcontinent. The vast majority are small stone seals, typically about 2 to 3 centimeters square, bearing an image, usually of an animal, a bull, a rhinoceros, an elephant, a tiger, or a mysterious creature that appears to have one horn, the so-called unicorn, and a short text in the Indus script. The script consists of roughly 400 to 600 distinct signs, depending on how one counts variant forms and how one distinguishes independent signs from ligatures or combined characters. The texts are extremely short. The average inscription contains fewer than 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains only 26 signs. These numbers create an almost insurmountable problem for decipherment. Every successful decipherment of an ancient script in the history of scholarship has depended on at least one of two things: either a bilingual text, an inscription that presents the same content in two scripts, one known and one unknown, providing a key for translation, or a large corpus of lengthy texts, providing enough material for statistical analysis and pattern recognition. The Indus script has neither. When the Egyptian hieroglyphics were deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s, the breakthrough came through the Rosetta Stone, a slab inscribed with the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. The Greek provided the known reference against which the unknown hieroglyphics could be decoded. No such bilingual text has been found for the Indus script. When Mesopotamian cuneiform was deciphered in the 1850s by scholars including Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks, they had access to thousands of lengthy texts, administrative records, legal codes, literary epics, religious hymns, and royal inscriptions. The Indus script corpus consists entirely of short labels and brief inscriptions, averaging fewer than 5 signs per text. There is simply not enough material to work with. It is like trying to learn a language from reading only license plates and store signs. The question of whether the Indus script represents a true writing system, a full language with grammar, syntax, and the ability to record continuous speech, or whether it is a simpler system of symbols, perhaps representing names, titles, clan affiliations, or commodity labels, remains fiercely debated among scholars. In 2004, a team of researchers led by Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel published a provocative paper arguing that the Indus script was not a form of writing at all, but a collection of non-linguistic symbols, similar to heraldic devices, trademarks, or the symbols used on modern packaging to indicate recycling or electrical safety. This argument provoked an intense backlash from South Asian scholars, many of whom interpreted it as a dismissal of the Indus Valley civilization's intellectual achievements. The debate generated enormous heat and, to date, very little resolution. If the Indus script is a true writing system, then we are in possession of the written words of 5 million people and cannot read any of them. If it is not a writing system, then we must ask an even more troubling question. Did the largest urban civilization of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era truly lack writing? Did 5 million people build cities, conduct international trade, manage agricultural surpluses, and coordinate construction projects across a territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, all without the ability to write down a law, record a debt, tell a story, or compose a prayer? Either answer is extraordinary. Either answer forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between literacy, complexity, and civilization. And either answer deepens the silence that surrounds the Indus Valley, a silence that grows louder the more we learn. Dozens of attempts have been made to crack the Indus script over the past century. Scholars have proposed readings based on Dravidian languages, on early forms of Sanskrit, on Sumerian parallels, on Elamite analogies, on Proto-Munda linguistic models, and on various other linguistic families. Each proposed decipherment has generated excitement, media attention, and debate, followed by skepticism and rebuttal from other scholars. None has achieved the consensus that would make it accepted by the field as a whole. The Indus script remains, after more than a century of effort by some of the most brilliant linguists and archaeologists in the world, one of the last great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world. In 2009, a team of researchers led by Rajesh Rao of the University of Washington applied statistical analysis and machine learning techniques to the Indus script corpus. They analyzed the patterns of sign sequences, comparing the statistical properties of the Indus signs with those of known linguistic scripts, such as Sumerian and Old Tamil, and known non-linguistic symbol systems, such as DNA sequences, computer programming languages, and Vinca symbols from prehistoric Europe. Their analysis suggested that the Indus script showed patterns consistent with a spoken language, rather than a non-linguistic symbol system, the conditional entropy of the sign sequences, a measure of how predictable each sign is given the signs that precede it, fell within the range typical of linguistic scripts and well outside the range of non-linguistic symbol systems. But the study was challenged by Farmer and Sproat, who argued that the statistical methods used could not reliably distinguish between linguistic and non-linguistic systems at such short text lengths. The question remains open, and it may remain open indefinitely unless longer texts are discovered. The script is the lock. Without the key, the Indus Valley civilization will continue to speak to us only through its objects, its buildings, its bones, and the haunting geometry of its empty streets. We can admire it. We can measure it. We can catalogue every brick and every bead. But we cannot hear its voice. But let us not lose sight of what we do know, because what we know is itself extraordinary. We know that the Indus Valley people were master craft people whose skills in certain domains have never been surpassed. Their bead-making techniques, particularly their method of producing long barrel-shaped beads of carnelian, a semi-precious stone of deep red colour, were so sophisticated that modern artisans in the same region of Gujarat and Sindh still use strikingly similar methods today, a tradition of craft that has persisted in attenuated form for over 4,000 years, even as the civilization that developed those techniques has been completely forgotten. The carnelian beads required a multi-step process. First, the raw stone was shaped by chipping and grinding. Then it was subjected to prolonged heating, sometimes for days, in a carefully controlled kiln to change its colour and improve its workability. Then it was drilled, using a drill bit of a harder stone or, in some cases, a hollow copper tube fed with an abrasive paste. The longest beads were drilled from both ends, requiring extraordinary precision to ensure the holes met in the middle. Some beads found at Indus Valley sites are over 13 centimetres long and drilled with holes less than 2 millimetres in diameter. The skill required to produce them is staggering. We know they traded widely and strategically. Indus Valley artifacts, particularly the distinctive etched carnelian beads and cubic chert weights, have been found at sites in Mesopotamia, Oman, Bahrain, and along the coast of East Africa. Mesopotamian texts from the period reference the land of Meluha as a source of precious stones, metals, exotic animals, and fine textiles. A Mesopotamian cylinder seal found at Mohenjo-Daro and Indus-style artifacts found at the Mesopotamian site of Ur suggest direct, sustained commercial contact between the two civilizations. This was not casual exchange. This was organized international trade, conducted over distances of more than 2,000 kilometers by sea. We know they were skilled farmers who cultivated wheat, barley, peas, sesame, and cotton, and who may have been among the first peoples anywhere to domesticate chickens. We know they built boats capable of navigating the Arabian Sea, because their goods reached the markets of Sumer, and their harbours have been found at coastal sites like Lothal in Gujarat. We know they were capable of remarkable feats of urban planning and civil engineering, and we know, from the uniformity of their material culture across an enormous territory, that they possessed some system, whether political, religious, economic, or cultural, that enabled coordination on a scale that would not be matched in South Asia for millennia. All of this knowledge, all of this skill, all of this complexity, packed into a civilization that left no readable record of itself. It is as if someone built a vast, intricate library filled with the accumulated wisdom of millions of people, and then removed every book, leaving only the shelves and the empty reading rooms, beautiful and purposeful and utterly, devastatingly silent. There is a truth embedded in the story of the Indus Valley civilization that extends far beyond the specifics of ancient South Asia, far beyond the details of bricks and beads and undeciphered seals. It is a truth about the nature of civilizational memory itself, about the conditions under which knowledge persists and the conditions under which it is erased. And it is a truth that, once grasped, changes the way we think about our own place in time, our own relationship with the future, and the permanence of everything we have built. We tend to assume that knowledge, once gained, is permanent. We look at the arc of human history as a steady accumulation, each generation building on the discoveries of the last, an unbroken chain of progress, stretching from the first stone tools to the digital networks of the modern world. This assumption is embedded in our language. We speak of the march of progress, the advance of knowledge, the forward movement of history. We assume that what we know today will be known tomorrow, and that what is known tomorrow will include everything known today plus something new. The line goes up. It always goes up. But this assumption is wrong. The historical record is not a smooth upward curve. It is jagged, interrupted, full of gaps and reversals and catastrophic drops. Knowledge is gained and then lost, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia, sometimes forever. Techniques are mastered and then forgotten. Cities are built and then buried. Languages are spoken by millions and then silenced until no ear remains that can understand them. The line does not always go up. Sometimes it plunges, sometimes it flatlines, and sometimes it disappears entirely, leaving behind only a blank space where something remarkable used to be. The Indus Valley Civilization is perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, but it is far from the only one. Consider the example of Roman concrete. The Romans developed a hydraulic concrete called opus caementitium that could set underwater, forming a rock-hard mass that was resistant to erosion, chemical attack, and the passage of time. This material was extraordinary. Roman structures built with it, harbours, aqueducts, breakwaters, the dome of the Pantheon, have survived for 2,000 years, in many cases outlasting structures built with modern Portland cement. The Pantheon's dome, spanning over 43 metres with no internal supports, is the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built, and it was poured in approximately 125 of the Common Era. It still stands, it still functions, it is still watertight. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era, the formula for this concrete was lost. Not hidden, not suppressed, not deliberately destroyed, just lost. The people who knew how to make it died, without passing the knowledge on, or the institutional structures that had supported its production disappeared, or the trade networks that supplied its ingredients were disrupted, or some combination of all these factors. Whatever the cause, Europe did not redevelop comparable concrete technology until the 18th century. 1300 years. 1300 years during which builders in Europe constructed with stone, timber, and mortar, never knowing that a superior building material had once been available to their predecessors, had once been as common as brick, had once been the foundation of the most impressive structures in the Western world. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, a Greek device recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of the small Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. Initially dismissed as a corroded lump of bronze, it was later recognized as something astounding, an analog computer, a complex mechanism of interlocking bronze gears designed to predict astronomical events, including eclipses, the phases of the moon, the positions of the known planets, and even the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. The mechanism contained at least 37 meshing bronze gears, and possibly more, with tolerances of fractions of a millimeter. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity would be built anywhere in the world for over 1,000 years. The knowledge that created it, the understanding of gear ratios, astronomical cycles, and precision metalworking that made it possible, vanished with the civilization that produced it. It was not passed on. It was not developed further. It was simply lost. These are not isolated curiosities. They are not footnotes in the history of technology. They are evidence of a fundamental vulnerability in human civilization, a vulnerability so basic and so pervasive that we tend to overlook it precisely because it is so fundamental: the fragility of transmitted knowledge. Every piece of knowledge that exists in a civilization, every technique, every formula, every design, every story, every belief, exists because someone taught it to someone else. Who taught it to someone else? Who taught it to someone else? This chain of transmission is the only thing that keeps knowledge alive. Break that chain at any point, and the knowledge is gone. It does not matter how sophisticated it was. It does not matter how useful it was. It does not matter how many people once possessed it, or how widely it was once known. If the chain of transmission is broken, the knowledge might as well have never existed. Let that sink in. The Indus Valley Civilization had a chain of transmission that functioned for over 700 years, and perhaps considerably longer if we include the early Harappan developmental period. During that time, the knowledge of how to fire bricks to precise specifications, how to lay out streets on a grid, how to build drainage systems with removable inspection covers, how to carve seals with miniature precision, how to produce long barrel-shaped carnelian beads, using a technique that required sustained high-temperature heating over many days, how to formulate the chert weights in exact binary progressions, how to manage long-distance maritime trade. All of this was passed from generation to generation, from master to apprentice, from parent to child, from elder to youth. The chain held. For 700 years, across 1,000,000 square kilometers, the chain held. And then, over the span of a few generations, it broke. The knowledge leaked away, not all at once, but gradually. Like water from a cracked vessel, the finest skills were the first to go, because they required the most specialized conditions to sustain. The broad traditions lasted longer, persisting in diminished form in the post-urban settlements of the East and South. But by the time the process was complete, a few centuries after it began, the vessel was empty, and no one remembered what it had contained. Why does this happen? Why do chains of transmission break? The answer, in most cases, comes down to a single word: context. Knowledge does not exist in isolation. It exists within a web of supporting conditions, institutions, social structures, economic systems, environmental circumstances, and cultural values that make it relevant, sustainable, and worth the effort of passing on. When those conditions change, the knowledge they supported can become orphaned, disconnected from the purposes and systems that gave it meaning and value. A beadmaker's techniques are valuable in a city with trade networks that create demand for luxury beads. Remove the trade networks, and the techniques have no economic purpose. They may persist for a generation or two as tradition, as inherited habit, as something old people know how to do. But without economic support, without apprentices who see a future in learning them, without customers who will pay for the products, the techniques will eventually be abandoned, not through malice, not through negligence, through the simple, brutal logic of survival. When resources are scarce, you maintain what matters most. And what mattered most in the post-urban Indus world was not drainage systems or trade beads or engraved seals, but food, shelter, water, and the daily work of keeping a household alive. The skills that had sustained the civilization were the first casualties of its dissolution, precisely because they were the most specialized, the most dependent on urban infrastructure, and the least transferable to a rural, subsistence-oriented way of life. A farmer does not need to know how to fire bricks to exact proportions. A herder does not need to know the binary weight system. A family scratching a living from a small plot of rain-fed land does not need an elaborate covered drainage system. These technologies were not abandoned because they were bad. They were abandoned because they were unnecessary, and in a world of diminishing resources, the unnecessary is the first thing to go. There is a melancholy in this that goes beyond the merely academic. It is the melancholy of watching skill and knowledge and accumulated wisdom evaporate simply because the world that needed them has changed. The beadmaker, who knew how to drill a perfect hole through 13 centimeters of solid carnelian, did not pass that knowledge on because there was no one who needed to know it. The scribe, who could read and write the Indus signs, did not teach a student because there was no institution that would employ a graduate. The engineer, who understood the mathematics of drainage gradients, did not train an apprentice because there were no drains left to build. The knowledge died not because it was rejected, but because it was irrelevant. And irrelevance, in the economy of cultural transmission, is a death sentence. This is what happened in the Indus Valley. The knowledge was not destroyed by an invader or suppressed by a conqueror. It was dissolved by the slow erosion of the conditions that had sustained it. As the cities shrank and the trade networks contracted, the specialized skills that had flourished in the urban environment lost their context. A drainage engineer has no work in a village of 50 people who draw water from a well. A seal carver has no clients in a community that no longer engages in long-distance trade. A bead maker has no market in a settlement that cannot afford luxury goods. The skills that had defined the civilization became irrelevant to the daily lives of the people who had once practiced them, and so they were allowed to lapse, one by one, generation by generation, until nothing remained but the faintest echoes. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of how civilizational knowledge is lost. It happens not through some dramatic catastrophe, not through the burning of a great library or the massacre of a community of scholars, but through the quiet, incremental abandonment of skills and systems that are no longer needed in a changed world. The builders of Mohenjo-Daro did not wake up one morning and decide to forget how to build drains. They simply stopped needing drains of that complexity, and within a few generations, the knowledge of how to build them was gone. No one decided to forget. The forgetting happened on its own, through the natural attrition of disuse. Let that sink in. Now apply this understanding to the Indus script. If the script was a specialized technology used primarily in administrative or commercial contexts within urban centers by a trained class of scribes or merchants or administrators, then the collapse of the urban system would have removed its primary context of use. A script that is useful for labeling trade goods, marking property, recording transactions, or identifying the owners of seal impressions has little purpose in a dispersed, rural, subsistence-oriented society where trade is local and property relations are governed by kinship and custom rather than written documentation. Without the urban institutions that created demand for literacy, the script would have become orphaned. It would have been taught to fewer and fewer people with each generation. Within a century or two, no one would have remembered how to read it. This scenario is not hypothetical. It has happened multiple times in documented history. The Linear A script of Minoan Crete, used by a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization for administrative and religious purposes, became extinct when Minoan civilization declined and was absorbed by the Mycenaean Greeks. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean Greeks themselves, was lost when the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed during the Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 years before the Common Era. Greece entered a period of several centuries, sometimes called the Greek Dark Age, during which the art of writing was completely forgotten in the Greek world. The Greeks did not regain literacy until they adopted and modified the Phoenician alphabet several centuries later, creating the Greek alphabet that would eventually give rise to the Latin alphabet used across much of the world today. An entire literate civilization became illiterate, lost the ability to write for centuries, and only regained it by borrowing a completely different system from a completely different culture. The implications of this pattern are profound and deeply uncomfortable. They suggest that literacy, far from being a permanent achievement of human civilization, is a technology that requires constant maintenance and institutional support to survive. Without the schools, the scribes, the administrative systems, the economic incentives, and the cultural values that sustain it, writing can die. And when writing dies, it takes with it the stories, the laws, the beliefs, the prayers, the accounts, the accumulated wisdom of the people who once used it. It takes their voice. Consider how many voices have been lost in this way. The Etruscans, who dominated central Italy before the rise of Rome, and whose language can be partially read but not fully understood, left behind inscriptions that grow shorter and fewer as Latin replaced Etruscan in daily use. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Etruscan was a dead language, preserved only in a handful of ritual texts and the occasional scholarly reference. The Etruscans were not destroyed by Rome. They were absorbed, their language gradually displaced by the tongue of their conquerors until no one remembered how to speak it. The language died not through violence but through disuse, through the quiet erosion of a community of speakers who found it more practical to speak Latin than to maintain their ancestral tongue. The same process, operating at a much larger scale and over a much shorter period, may explain the death of the Indus script. As the urban context that had sustained literacy dissolved, as the communities of scribes and merchants who had used the script dispersed into smaller, more isolated settlements, the pool of literate individuals shrank. Each generation had fewer teachers. Each generation produced fewer students. The script became an inheritance without heirs, a skill without pupils, a voice without listeners, and then it was gone. The philosopher Walter Benjamin once described the past as an image that flashes up at the moment of its recognizability and is never seen again if that moment is missed. The Indus Valley Civilization was recognized, barely, in the 1920s, but the deeper content of that civilization, the meaning of its signs, the names of its people, the beliefs that animated their daily lives, these remain unrecognized. The image has appeared, partially, tantalizingly, in the form of bricks and beads and carved seals. But the full picture, the living picture, the picture that would show us who these people truly were, remains hidden, perhaps forever. The Indus Valley people had a voice. For 700 years, they carved their sazins to stone and pressed their seals into clay and plaster. They inscribed, and what they inscribed was meaningful to them. And now that voice is silent, not because the inscriptions were destroyed, for they survive in their thousands, studied and catalogued and photographed with exquisite care, but because no one alive can understand what they say. The objects speak, the language is mute, the medium survives, the message is lost. This brings us to a broader and more uncomfortable truth about the human relationship with the past. We think of history as something we know. We think of the past as a story that has been told and understood, a narrative that begins with the earliest settlements and runs, more or less continuously, to the present day. But this is an illusion. The history we know is a thin, fragile layer of narrative stretched over an abyss of forgetting. For every civilization whose story has been recovered, there may be others whose stories are lost forever. For every script that has been deciphered, there may be scripts that will never be read. For every city that has been excavated, there may be cities that will never be found, their remains too deeply buried, too thoroughly destroyed, or too remote from the paths of modern development to be discovered. The Indus Valley Civilization is a reminder that the abyss is real and that it is closer than we think. A civilization of 5 million people, covering an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, flourishing for 700 years, with standardized infrastructure and long-distance trade networks, and then vanishing so completely that its existence was unknown until less than a century ago. If that can be forgotten, what else has been? What other achievements lie beneath the soil, unexcavated, unrecognized, their stories untold? What knowledge has been lost that we do not even know we have lost? The scale of potential loss is staggering when considered carefully. Modern archaeology has excavated only a tiny fraction of the Indus Valley Civilization's territory. Of the 1,500 or more known sites, fewer than 100 have been subjected to systematic excavation, and most of those only partially. Major sites like Ganwariwala in the Cholistan Desert have barely been touched. Entire regions of the civilization's territory, particularly in the now dry riverbed of the Gagahakra, remain largely unsurveyed. We are making judgments about a civilization of 5 million people based on what amounts to a handful of keyhole glimpses into a vast and largely unexplored landscape. And yet, even what we have seen is enough to tell us that the Indus Valley Civilization was something extraordinary, something that challenges our models and defies our categories. A civilization without visible kings, without monumental self-glorification, without conquest inscriptions or royal propaganda. A civilization that invested in drainage rather than palaces, in public baths rather than pyramids, in standardized weights rather than triumphal arches. If this sounds utopian, it probably was not. Every society has its hierarchies, its tensions, its injustices. But the Indus Valley's particular way of organizing itself, whatever it was, produced a material culture of remarkable uniformity, durability, and practical intelligence, a culture that prioritized the infrastructure of daily life over the spectacle of power. And it was all lost, not destroyed by enemies but abandoned by its own people, not in a moment of dramatic failure but through a slow generational process of simplification and dispersal. The knowledge was not taken from them. It slipped away, quietly, like a language that fewer and fewer people speak until the last speaker dies and the words dissolve into silence. These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones, because the lesson of the Indus Valley is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about the conditions under which knowledge survives and the conditions under which it perishes. And it is about whether we, with all our technology and all our confidence in the permanence of progress, are as immune to forgetting as we like to believe. Stand for a moment in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, not in your imagination, but in the reality of the place as it exists today. The walls are crumbling, worn by sun and wind, and the slow chemistry of salt crystallization that is eating the bricks from within. The streets that once carried the feet of 40,000 people are empty, their surfaces exposed to a sky that no longer remembers the awnings and rooftops that once shaded them. The Great Bath is dry, its bitumen lining cracked, its carefully fitted bricks separating along ancient mortar lines. The wells are silent, their shafts filled with debris. The drains that once carried wastewater from every household through a network of covered channels are choked with the dust of centuries. This city was abandoned roughly 3,900 years ago, give or take a century. For most of those millennia, it was invisible, buried under meters of alluvial soil deposited by the flooding of the Indus River, covered by scrub vegetation and the thin grass of the Sindh plain. Its existence was unsuspected by the people who lived above it, who walked over its streets and ploughed fields over its workshops without any awareness that beneath their feet lay one of the greatest urban achievements in human history. Farmers tilled the soil over its granaries. Children played on mounds that concealed its public buildings. Generation after generation lived and died within walking distance of a marvel they could not see and did not know about. What does that say about us? What does that say about the permanence of anything we build? What does that say about the assumptions we make when we pour the foundations of our own cities, when we lay the cables for our own networks, when we store the records of our own civilization in the vaults and servers and archives that we trust to hold them? We live in an age of unprecedented information. The digital networks that connect the modern world carry more data in a single day than all the inscriptions of the Indus Valley civilization combined. We photograph everything, from the meals we eat to the monuments we visit. We record conversations, transactions, medical records, legal proceedings, weather data, satellite imagery, and the minutiae of billions of individual lives. We store petabytes of information on servers in climate-controlled facilities spread across continents. We have redundancy, we have backups, we have the cloud. Surely, we tell ourselves, we are immune to the kind of forgetting that swallowed the Indus Valley. Surely our records will endure. Surely our story will be told. But consider the fragility of our own systems. Digital storage requires electricity. It requires functioning hardware, processors, memory chips, and storage media that are manufactured in complex global supply chains involving dozens of countries and thousands of specialized components. It requires software that can read the formats in which data is stored. And those formats change with every generation of technology. It requires institutions to maintain the servers, pay the electricity bills, upgrade the systems, migrate the data from obsolete formats to current ones. Remove any of these supporting conditions, and the data becomes inaccessible. A hard drive without power is just a piece of metal and glass. A file in an obsolete format is just a string of ones and zeros without meaning. The digital revolution has given us the ability to store more information than any previous civilization in human history, but it has also made that information more dependent on a complex, energy-intensive, globally integrated infrastructure than any previous form of record-keeping. The Indus Valley people wrote on stone and baked clay. Their inscriptions have survived for 4,000 years in the open air, readable, at least in principle, by anyone who picks them up. We write on magnetic disks, solid-state chips, and optical media that degrade within decades. We depend on software platforms that become obsolete within years. We trust corporations that may not exist in a century. How long will our inscriptions survive if the systems that read them are no longer maintained? How long before our digital records become as unreadable as the Indus seals? Not because the medium has been destroyed, but because the context needed to interpret them has been lost. This is not a prediction of doom. It is not a prophecy of collapse. It is a reflection on vulnerability, the same vulnerability that the Indus Valley civilizations discovered too late. The vulnerability of any complex system that depends on the uninterrupted functioning of many interconnected parts. Every civilization believes it is permanent. Every civilization assumes that its achievements will endure. The Egyptians carved their names into granite because they believed granite was eternal. The Romans built their roads to last forever, and in many cases they did, outlasting the empire that built them by 15 centuries and counting. The Indus Valley people, whatever they believed about the future, must have assumed that their cities, their drains, their carefully gridded streets, their standardized bricks, would continue to function as they had always functioned. None of them imagined a time when their greatest works would be curiosities buried under foreign soil, studied by people who could not read their language, could not name their gods, and could not tell the difference between their kings and their merchants. And yet here we are, standing in their ruins, puzzling over their seals, debating whether their symbols represent language or decoration. The gap between what they were and what we know about them is immense, a chasm 4,000 years wide that may never be fully bridged. The archaeologist Stuart Pigott, who worked on Indus Valley material in the mid-20th century, once described Mohenjo-Daro as a civilization that was efficient but dull. He meant that the uniformity of the material culture, the standardized bricks, the repetitive pottery forms, the absence of monumental art, gave the impression of a society that valued order and conformity over individual expression and grandeur. This judgment, which has been widely repeated, reveals more about the expectations of the observer than about the reality of the observed. Pigott was comparing the Indus Valley to Egypt and Mesopotamia, civilizations that left behind colossal statues, epic poems, and elaborate royal tombs. By that standard, the Indus Valley does look plain. But plainness is not dullness, uniformity is not emptiness. The absence of ostentatious display may reflect not a poverty of imagination, but a fundamentally different set of values, a culture that invested its creative energy in the quality of its infrastructure, the fairness of its distribution systems, and the comfort of its citizens rather than in the glorification of its rulers. We call it dull because we cannot read its poetry. We call it faceless because we do not know its faces. We judge an entire civilization by the accident of what survives and what is lost. There is a philosophical term for this kind of gap. It is called the horizon of intelligibility, the boundary beyond which another culture's thoughts and experiences become opaque to us, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the conceptual frameworks that gave those thoughts meaning no longer exist. We can hold an Indus seal in our hands. We can trace the lines of its engraved animal with our fingers. We can measure the depth of each carved sign with a micrometer, but we cannot think the thoughts that produced it. The mind that carved those symbols inhabited a world of meanings, associations, beliefs, and experiences that we can only guess at. The seal is a message from a world that no longer exists, addressed to a future that cannot receive it. We hold these seals in climate-controlled museum cases now. We photograph them with high-resolution cameras, scan them with electron microscopes, and publish detailed catalogues of their imagery and inscriptions. We treat them with the reverence that sacred objects deserve, which is appropriate, because for all we know, they were sacred objects, or commercial instruments, or identification badges, or amulets, or something else entirely that we lack the cultural context to understand. Each seal is a tiny window into a lost world, but the glass is frosted, and we can see only shadows. We can describe the shadows with exquisite precision. We can measure them, classify them, compare them with shadows from other windows. But we cannot open the window. We cannot step through it into the world on the other side. This is the deepest loss. Not the cities, though the cities are gone. Not the trade goods, though the trade networks are dissolved. Not even the script, though the script remains unread. The deepest loss is the interior world of the Indus Valley people, their subjective experience of being alive, their understanding of the world they inhabited, their sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. These are things that no archaeology can recover, because they exist not in objects but in minds, and the minds that held them are 4,000 years gone, dissolved back into the earth that once supported the cities, that once sheltered the people who once thought those thoughts. We mourn the pyramids when they erode. We mourn the libraries when they burn. We mourn the manuscripts when they crumble, but we rarely mourn the thoughts that were never written down, the songs that were never recorded, the beliefs that were never carved into stone, the jokes that were told around cooking fires and laughed at and then forgotten. The Indus Valley Civilization reminds us that the greatest losses are often invisible. They are the thoughts and feelings and understandings that perished with the people who held them, leaving no trace in the material record, no echo in the archaeological soil. 5 million people lived, loved, feared, hoped, prayed, argued, worked, rested, celebrated, grieved, and died across a territory larger than any other civilization of their age. And we cannot hear a single one of their voices. We cannot read a single word they wrote. We cannot tell a single story they told. Every generation inherits a world it did not build, and will leave a world it cannot control. The Indus Valley people inherited a world of rivers and monsoons and fertile plains, a world that must have seemed, to those who lived in it, permanent and reliable. They built something magnificent upon it, something unprecedented in scale and sophistication. A civilization that coordinated 5 million lives across 1 million square kilometers without, as far as we can tell, the apparatus of kingship or conquest. And when the rivers shifted and the monsoons weakened and the conditions that had sustained them changed, they discovered that what they had built was more fragile than anyone had imagined. They did not fail because they were foolish or lazy or wicked. They did not fail because they lacked intelligence or effort or ambition. They failed because the conditions of their success were temporary, and the speed of environmental change exceeded the speed of social and technological adaptation. This is a lesson that applies not only to the ancient world, but to the modern one. It is not enough to build well. One must also build with the awareness that the conditions of today are not guaranteed to be the conditions of tomorrow. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro are still crumbling today. Despite decades of conservation efforts by the Pakistani government and international organizations, including UNESCO, the site is threatened by rising groundwater, salt erosion, and exposure to the elements. Some researchers have warned that within the next few decades, the exposed portions of the city, the very portions that visitors can walk through and archaeologists can study, may deteriorate beyond recognition if current trends continue. The bricks that have survived for 4,000 years may not survive another 100. The irony is almost unbearable. The civilization that was forgotten for millennia may be physically erased, just as we are beginning, barely beginning, to understand what it was. There is a kind of silence that is louder than any sound. It is the silence of a city with no one left to speak its name. It is the silence of streets that once echoed with the voices of thousands, and now echo with nothing at all. Nothing but the wind moving through broken doorways, and the faint rustle of dust settling into corners where children once sat. It is the silence of a script that covers thousands of objects and says nothing to any living reader. A silence made more profound by the presence of the inscriptions themselves, like sealed letters that can never be opened. The Indus Valley civilization occupies this silence. It inhabits it. For 4,000 years, it has been the quiet at the center of human history, the great blank space on the map of the ancient world, the civilization that should not have been forgotten but was. It is the ghost at the feast of human achievement, present in the archaeological record but absent from the human story, visible in its bricks and beads and bones, but invisible in its thoughts, its words, its meanings. 5 million people, 1,500 settlements. Cities with running water and public baths and drainage systems that would not be equaled in sophistication for millennia. Artisans who could drill perfect cylindrical holes through solid carnelian, a stone harder than steel, using techniques that required days of sustained, carefully controlled heat and the patience of generations of accumulated expertise. Traders who sailed the Arabian Sea with holds full of cotton and shell and semi-precious stone, navigating by stars and currents across open water to reach the harbours of Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. Architects who laid out streets with the precision of professional surveyors and maintained their plans, unchanged in principle, across 7 centuries and 1 million square kilometres of territory. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it confirmed by a century of excavation and analysis, and all of it silent. Not the silence of destruction, not the silence that follows a battle, when the screaming stops and the smoke drifts away and the crows descend on the field. Not the silence that follows a plague, when the living cannot bury the dead fast enough. Not the silence of a natural disaster, of a flood or an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, but the silence of dissolution, the silence of a civilization that simply came apart, slowly, quietly, without violence, without drama, without a single identifiable moment of ending. Like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread, until nothing remained but a heap of loose fibers, each one intact but no longer part of a pattern, no longer telling a story, no longer forming a picture that anyone could recognize or remember. This is the lesson of the Indus Valley, and it is a lesson that resonates far beyond the boundaries of ancient South Asia, far beyond the discipline of archaeology, far beyond the academic debates about climate and migration and script and governance. It is a lesson about the nature of civilization itself. Civilizations are not permanent structures built on solid foundations. They are processes, ongoing acts of coordination and maintenance and renewal that must be actively sustained from generation to generation. They do not persist through inertia. They persist through effort, through the daily work of teaching, building, repairing, governing, trading, creating, and remembering. And when the effort falters, when the conditions that made the effort possible and worthwhile change beyond the capacity of adaptation, the process stalls, the civilization begins to dissolve, and the dissolution, once begun, can proceed with a quietness that is far more frightening than any catastrophe. We like to believe that progress is irreversible, that once a society has achieved a certain level of complexity, a certain density of knowledge, a certain scale of organization, it cannot go back, that the arrow of history points only forward. The Indus Valley tells us otherwise. It tells us that complexity is not a one-way street, that cities can become villages, that literacy can become silence, that trade networks spanning seas can contract to the radius of a single day's walk, that the things we know can be unknowed, not through some dramatic act of erasure, but through the simple, quiet failure to pass them on. The people of the Indus Valley did not vanish from the earth. Their genetic legacy flows through the populations of modern South Asia. Their craft traditions survive in attenuated forms in the workshops of Sindh and Gujarat, where artisans still make carnelian beads using methods that echo techniques developed over 4,000 years ago. Their agricultural practices, their cultivation of wheat, barley, and cotton, continued and spread throughout the subcontinent. Their memory, if it can be called that, persists in fragments and echoes, in the shape of a bead, in the proportions of a brick, in the tress of a river that no longer flows. But the civilization they built is gone. Gone in the way that a song is gone when the last person who knew the melody dies and the silence fills the space where the music used to be. Gone in the way that a language is gone when the last speaker falls silent and the words dissolve into the air, leaving no vibration, no resonance, no trace. Gone not from the earth, for the earth still holds their bricks and their bones, but from the chain of human memory, which is the only place where civilizations truly live. We have their bricks, we have their beads, we have their seals with their beautiful, mysterious animals, the great humped bull with its heavy dewlap, the one-horned creature that may or may not be a unicorn, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, each one carved with a precision and a tenderness that suggests the carver knew these animals well, perhaps revered them, perhaps told stories about them that we will never hear. We have the short, unreadable inscriptions that accompany these images, signs that may or may not be language, that may or may not contain the names of owners, or merchants, or gods, or places. We have the outlines of their cities, the plans of their houses, the dimensions of their streets and drains and wells and bathing platforms. We have everything except the one thing that matters most: their story, their words, their voice, the sound of their world as it sounded to those who lived in it. And so we stand in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, in the dry, heavy heat of a Sindh afternoon, and we look at the walls that have stood for 4,000 years, and we feel the weight of all that has been lost. Not just a civilization, though a civilization is enough. Not just an architecture or an economy or a system of urban management, though these are extraordinary in themselves. but the inner life of a civilization, the thoughts of its thinkers, the faith of its believers, the worry of its parents, the curiosity of its children, the pride of its builders, the satisfaction of its artisans, the loneliness of its travelers, the grief of its mourners, the laughter that filled its streets on festival days, the quiet conversation of neighbors in the cool of the evening. All of it gone, dissolved into the same earth that swallowed their cities and buried their names. The Indus Valley Civilization was one of the great achievements of the human species. It demonstrated that large-scale, cooperative, technologically sophisticated urban life was possible at a time when most of the world's population still lived in small, scattered communities bound together by kinship and custom. It showed that human beings could organize themselves across vast distances, could coordinate the production and distribution of goods, could maintain shared standards and shared infrastructure across territory that would take weeks to traverse on foot. It built cities that still astonish engineers and archaeologists today, cities whose drainage systems and urban planning put many modern settlements to shame. And it was forgotten, so completely, so utterly forgotten, that when its ruins were finally uncovered in the 20th century, the world had to be told, as if for the first time, that one of its greatest civilizations had existed and had been lost. The announcement was met with disbelief, then wonder, then a slow, growing unease that has never fully subsided, the unease that comes from realizing that the past is not what we thought it was, that the story of human civilization has chapters we have never read and may never be able to read. Somewhere beneath the soil of South Asia, there are settlements still waiting to be found. There are artifacts still waiting to be unearthed. There are walls and streets and wells still hidden under the accumulated weight of 40 centuries of soil and silence. And there may be, somewhere, the one discovery that changes everything, a longer text, a bilingual inscription, a Rosetta Stone of the Indus world that unlocks the script and gives voice, at last, to 5 million souls who have been silent for 4,000 years. Until that day comes, if it ever comes, the silence endures, the bricks endure, the mystery endures, and the dust settles over everything, as it has always settled, patient and indifferent, covering the works of human hands with the quiet finality of forgetting.